I am going to start with a puzzle that really motivated my research back in 2009 when I started working on this. And the puzzle was, this is data from 2016, but it's basically still, it's pretty similar still. The puzzle was this. If you look at Americans' policy positions, and they're not, obscure policy positions. These are on policies like immigration, the Affordable Care Act, abortion, same-sex marriage, government spending, gun control. These are things that most people have attitudes about. And if you just look at, if you take, let's say, you score a 0 if you're the most extremely liberal position and a 1 if you're the most extremely conservative position, and some people score in between. And so if you were answering every single one of these issues on the most extremely liberal end of the spectrum, you would score 0. And if you were the most extremely conservative, again, you would score a 1. So on the left-hand figure right here, what we're looking at is actually that Republicans are not all the way to 1. They're actually not even crossing 0.5, where, the center, what would be the very middle of the scale. And Democrats are further to the left than them. But there's a lot of, apparent common ground there. Another way to look at it is what percentage of these issues are people on the same side of the spectrum, right? So for a liberal, what percentage of the issues do they take the liberal position on the issue? And that's the right side. For Republicans, it was only 39% of the issues they were taking the conservative side, and for Democrats, 44% they were taking the conservative side. So this is a picture of an electorate that has plenty of room to compromise, right? This looks like a group of people that can talk to each other, that can figure out solutions together, that have a lot of similar interests and similar ideas about what the government should be doing. But in the exact same sample, these exact same people, if you ask them how they feel about each other, so you ask them on the left here is how Democrats feel about Republicans. And we use a thermometer scale. So basically, if you feel very cold towards them, they score 0. If you feel very warm towards them, you can score them at 100. And so Democrats here are rating Republicans at a very chilly 27 degrees on the thermometer, and they're rating their fellow Democrats at a nice warm 75. For Republicans, it's the opposite, right? I mean, it's basically the same relationship, but 73 for their fellow Republicans, 28 degrees for Democrats. This is not a picture of an electorate that has plenty of things in common and will get along and can make compromises and thinks of each other as collaborators in the project of governing. So that's the puzzle. That was the puzzle that motivated most of this work, was how is it that we have people who actually don't disagree very much about what government should do and what policies they want to see enacted, but they hate each other nonetheless? What is it that motivates that type of hatred? And what I did, because I study political psychology, I turned to the field of social psychology, where there are plenty of theories, and there have been plenty of theories for decades about why groups of people don't like each other, that have nothing to do with the role of government or taxes or any of these kind of practical political ideas. And I turned in particular to this guy named Henri Tajfel, who himself was quite a guy. He was Polish, he was a Polish Jew. He moved to France right before World War II and to study chemistry. As soon as the war broke out, he decided to join the French military and start fighting in the war. He was almost immediately captured by Nazi forces, and he spent 6 years in a Nazi prison camp. After which, when he emerged, he found that his entire family had been killed. And he decided that he didn't want to study chemistry anymore. He wanted to study what it is that makes people dislike each other or despise each other to such an extreme degree that they're willing to murder each other. And he also had been in the prison camp, he had pretended to be French. And he believes, for a lot of good reasons, he believes that just the idea that he was a French Jew and not a Polish Jew saved his life, because the guards there were more friendly to him because they believed that he was a Frenchman. And so nothing had changed about him, right? They were willing to murder him if he was from one place and not if he was from another. And so that's really what he wanted to study. And he came up with this idea of doing an experiment where he thought to himself, I'm going to create the weakest possible identity, social identity, that people are barely even connected to. And then once I create this identity, I'm going to start adding levels of conflict and competition between this identity and some other one. And I'll see at what point does bias emerge? At what point, what does it take for an identity or for a group identity to make you not like people in the other group or want to compete against them? And so in one of these experiments, he did many of these experiments, but in the classic one, he had people come into the lab and look at a bunch of dots on on a screen and asked them to estimate the number of dots on the screen. And they estimated the number of dots, and basically he told everyone, you are an overestimator. Other people are underestimators, but you are an overestimator. There's really no difference between them. It's just a common characteristic of this type of people that you are. And then he had them go through the rest of the survey. It was very kind of boring. And then at the very end, he said, I want to see how people allocate money. And for the purpose of this, I'm going to give you that overestimator label that I gave you before. And so when you're allocating money, I want to know, for the overestimators and the underestimators, how much money do people get? And this is an oversimplification, but he essentially gave them two scenarios. One, which I call the greater good scenario, was that everybody would get $5. The overestimators and the underestimators would get $5. The other was that your group, the overestimators, would get $4, but the underestimators, the outgroup, would get only $3. And he expected everybody to choose the greater good condition, and then he was going to add types of competition and reasons for disliking one another. But what he found was that people chose the condition that required them to sacrifice their own group's well-being in order to feel like they were better than the other group. So that sense of being superior, the sense of victory, was so important to people that they were willing to sacrifice the greater good of everybody. And again, he found this sort of multiple times in different scenarios. At one point, he even just tried telling people, you've been randomly assigned to two groups. And they still ended up doing this. So this is something very basic about people, that we have a need to be part of a group, and once we're part of a group, we have a very strong need to defend the status of that group. We want that group to be the best. So an overestimator is not a very strong identity. We have lots of identities. We identify with lots of groups of people, and any of these groups that we feel psychologically and socially connected to is an identity that we hold. So we are members of our party in an identity-based way. We think about people in our party as people like us. We think it's important for us to be a member of that group. When we talk about the group, we say we instead of they. And obviously, there's other clear identities like racial identities and religious identities that are, there's this rectangle up there, sorry. Racial identities and religious identities that are very deeply rooted in us, right? We kind of know about them our entire lives. And they're very important for our sense of status. Ideology can also be an identity. Feeling like you're connected to other people called liberals or other people called conservatives is a real identity, as well as a kind of worldview. So when all of these identities are kind of separated from each other, then when your party loses an election, it feels bad. You don't like it. Maybe you're sad or angry. But you still have all these other parts of your identity that make up who you are, that define you for yourself. But if all of these identities move into alignment with each other, then when the party loses, it sort of infects your sense of the status of all these other groups that you're a part of. And that kind of infection makes the feeling worse. When the party loses the election, all of a sudden it's not just your party that lost, it's your racial identity, it's your religious identity, it's your ideological identity. And that makes the stakes of elections feel, and also really be, more existential for a lot of people. And this is what's basically happened in American politics over the last few decades, basically in a process that occurred since the 1960s, beginning with the kind of civil rights legislation of the 1960s that alienated a lot of white Southern Democrats and pushed them towards the Republican Party. We now have two political parties that are socially very different from each other. And so when we think about Republicans, you immediately think about being conservative, you think about being white and rural, you think about being an evangelical Christian, right? These are all identities that are associated with the Republican label. For Democrats, you immediately think about them being liberal, about them being non-white or more urban, being non-Christian or non-religious at all. And so basically what we've created is a sense that when we go and we vote for the party, or when we think about party competition, we're not just thinking about the role of government, we're not just thinking about policies that we want to see enacted, we're thinking about all these other things that make us who we are in the world. And it implicates all of these other identities in our political decision making that makes it very hard for us to find a way to compromise. So what I found in my first project was that people who I call that social sorting, right? People who had these socially sorted identities or sort of the identities that match their party, they tend to be more prejudiced against people in the other party. They tend to be more active in politics on behalf of that prejudice, so not necessarily just for being a good citizen, it's because they really want to win. And they tend to be more emotionally volatile. They get more angry when they lose, and they get more happy when they win. And all of these things will happen no matter what their policy positions are. Even people who have policy positions that are closer to the other party will experience all of these things if their identities are lined up in the right way. So that is sort of part of the explanation for why we might have all of these common policies, the puzzle I set out at the beginning, where we have all these common policy positions, but we still don't like each other. That's partly because this identity-based, that our politics have become, sort of ruled by our sense of ourselves and where we are in the world. But in addition to this, so this is about who we are, right? Who am I, and how do my identities affect my politics? But we also have very strong attitudes about other people and how we think other people should be behaving in America, should be receiving the same kind of rights as everybody else, what kind of hierarchy, what kind of social hierarchy should we be expecting? And in that type of sorting, there's also been remarkable change over the last few decades. Racial resentment is a concept we've been measuring in political science. I'll explain to it. You don't have to be able to see all of it. Is a concept we've been measuring in political science since the 1980s, and it basically is a set of questions that say things like, it's about the relative equality of Black Americans with white Americans. And it says things like Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants work their way up. Black Americans should be able to do the same without any special favors. And it's effectively whether or not you admit systemic racism against Black Americans exists, or whether you think it's a real impediment to the progress of that group, the relative economic progress of that group. And so in this figure here, if you look back, the first year is 1986. This is just white Democrats and Republicans. If you look back to 1986, white Democrats and Republicans had exactly the same level of racial resentment. It was above the midpoint. And they stayed relatively undistinguishable until getting closer up, basically through Bill Clinton's presidency. And then you see where Obama is elected in 2008, the white Democrats become much more progressive. And the white Republicans kind of stay where they were. But part of the reason that the white Democrats are becoming so much more progressive isn't that all of them are changing their mind to believe that the systemic racism exists. It's that the Democrats who used to agree with Republicans on racial resentment become Republicans. And that lowers the overall average for white Democrats, right? So this is another sorting process that we have going on where the racially resentful Democrats are moving out of the party and they're joining the Republican Party, making the people who are left in the Democratic Party much more racially progressive. We also see this this is a particular question on racial discrimination is the main reason Black people can't get ahead. Agree or disagree? In 1994, the gap between Democrats and Republicans was 13 points. By 2020, it's 55 points. So this looks like very, very rapid sorting around a question that is controversial in American politics. It's difficult for us to have questions about racial equality in American politics in a calm and considered way. Often, those conversations don't go very well, especially if they're happening in public. But it's not just racial identity also, or racial equality. It's also thinking about the role of women in American society. So between 1970 and 2008, the American National Election Studies asked this question, basically asking, some people think that women should have an equal role with men in running business, industry, and government. Others think that a woman's place is in the home. And they asked this question, like I said, from 1970 to 2008, and then they stopped asking it because there was no difference left. Both Democrats and Republicans became more and more and more progressive on this concept to the point where by 2008 it was barely 10% of people that no one was disagreeing, and they had valuable survey space that they needed to replace with more important questions. So they stopped asking it. In 2022, my co-author and I added this question to one of our surveys. We did change it slightly, so the question wording does change a little bit. But we asked basically agree, disagree, women are better suited for taking care of the home than working in a job. And what we found really surprised us, which is that something has happened in between 2008 and 2022 with people's attitudes about women's equality, and especially for Republicans, right? Republicans basically went back to their 1980 levels of sentiment about women's equality Democrats got a little bit more conservative too, although this could be because of question wording, so you can talk about it later if you're interested. But so this trend where they were basically on the same page for decades, all of a sudden there's a divergence between Democrats and Republicans on this question. This is a question from the General Social Survey, where this is on same-sex. The question is it wrong for same-sex adults to have sexual relations? This is charting people who said not wrong at all. And what we see here is in 1970, basically, 10% of Democrats and Republicans said not wrong at all. By 2023, we're looking at 75% of Democrats saying that. And Republicans got more progressive too, but not to the degree that Democrats did. And again, this increase for Republicans is masking some division within the party, right? Some Republicans are becoming much more progressive on this question, and some are actually going back to where they were in 1970. And that's part of the reason why it's a slower process. Okay. And so we've asked questions of both Democrats and Republicans about these basic, social equality issues. The concept of patriarchy. Women are better suited for taking care of the home than working in a job. And then reverse coded, women should have as many leadership positions as men. On the left, this is just the distribution of attitudes. So 0 would be the most progressive score position, and 1 is the most conservative position. What you see is for Democrats, right, they are clustering around the lowest end of the spectrum. For Republicans, it's a much more distributed set of attitudes. So there are some Republicans that are quite progressive on this, and there are some Republicans that are very, very conservative still. Oops. When we looked at the concept of Christian nationalism, so this idea of going back to a time when Christianity is sort of the, not necessarily a time that really existed, but the questions are: Christian beliefs should influence everything our government does, and then reverse-coded, religious groups should generally stay out of politics. Again, the same distribution. We see Democrats very much clustered. 40% of Democrats are at the most progressive end of the spectrum. Republicans, there's a lot more difference between Republicans and how they think about this concept. And then finally, replacement theory, which is a theory that recent immigration is part of a plan to replace white Christian Americans with other groups. And we see the same basic pattern. So what we actually see here is a group of Republicans who are, a Republican Party that's actually internally divided. Some are interested in continuing the progress that we've made, and others would like to go back. And the reason I'm interested in these questions is because they are significantly correlated with approval of political violence. People who want to reimpose racial inequality, gender inequality, want to reimpose Christian nationalism, generally all of these attitudes have a significant relationship with approval of political violence. And we found this over and over again in many different surveys. But basically, this is the correlation coefficient, and the line on the left is just the 0. That's 0. So if it crosses that 0 line, then it's probably 0. This is really important because we have people who are thinking about inequality in a way that is connected with the way that they're thinking about violence. And it's not just theoretical. This is the Bridging Divides initiative at Princeton is keeping track of the number of threats that local officials are receiving, and kind of mapping them over time. What they found here is that if you look at the like green color, those are threats that people received on a racist basis. The blue is anti-LGBTQ. The yellow is anti-religious, which is almost always anti-Semitic. And the purple is sexist. So people who are doing their jobs in elected office in not national seats, but in local seats, local and state seats, they have been receiving increasing levels of threats against them and their families. And these are the type, the language of the threats mirrors some of these attitudes that we've been seeing increasingly associated with some people in the Republican Party. Oops, that's the wrong way. So the other thing is that one thing we know that motivates violence, or that can precede violence, is a concept that we call moral disengagement. And this is when we vilify and dehumanize people in the other group. So we've been asking Americans this question since 2017, basically multiple times a year. These are questions like, do you think people in the other party are a threat, a serious threat? They're not just worse for politics, they're downright evil, and many lack the traits to be considered fully human. They behave like animals. So dehumanization and vilification. When we started asking these questions, no one had asked them of Americans before. And we actually had some colleagues that told us that it was useless to ask these questions because nobody would ever agree with them. And what we found was the opposite. We saw basically 60 to 70% of partisans, these are Democrats and Republicans, the red line is Republicans, blue line is Democrats, willing to say the other party is a threat to the country. We saw between 40 up to around 60, 70% willing to say they're not just bad for politics, they're evil. And lower, but still alarming, between 20 and 35, 40% of partisans who are willing to call people in the other party subhuman. These are dangerous attitudes that always precede, whenever there is a mass violent event, these attitudes exist beforehand. This is the way that you harm another person and still feel like you're a moral person yourself. But we have some hope, because for those Republicans who are still kind of at the progressive end of the spectrum, this is basically charting levels of racial resentment and levels of moral disengagement. So racial resentment is on this axis, moral disengagement is on the vertical axis, and this line that's going up is Republicans. So for Republicans, those who are the highest in racial resentment are also the most willing to dehumanize and vilify Democrats. For Democrats, it's the opposite. The Democrats who are the lowest in racial resentment are the most willing to dehumanize and vilify Republicans. But there's this group of Republicans that is the most progressive on racial resentment in their party, and they are the most tolerant people in any of our samples, right? They don't dehumanize Democrats, they don't vilify Democrats. They're much more committed, even than Democrats are, to maintaining this kind of level of sort of not remove from politics, but just not going in with everything that you have. For Republicans, we see the same thing with sexism. So the Republicans, and for Democrats, we don't. But for Republicans, those who are the highest in sexism also dehumanize and vilify Democrats the most. Those who are the lowest in sexism are the least likely to do that. For Democrats, it doesn't matter how sexist they are, they feel the same way about Republicans. Okay, so, yes, I'm good on time. So this is basically a picture of a nation where the fight that we're having, clearly, one of the fights that we're having is an extremely difficult fight to have. And it's about the kind of full equality and dignity of numbers of groups that are traditionally marginalized in American society. And we're having a conversation about whether or not the progress that we've made, which really has been rapid progress, doesn't feel like it in your lives, but it really has been quite fast. Whether that progress is something that we want to keep working on and keep pushing forward, or whether we want to go back, make America great again, go back to a time when things made more sense, when the traditional social hierarchy was cemented, everyone knew their place, and they participated in society in a way that was according to their level in society. It should be obvious that democracies function better when they have diversity and pluralism. An increasingly diverse democracy is actually more robust and healthier. It's actually true of corporations also. Businesses that have more diversity in them tend to do better financially. People perform better when they are with a bunch of different kinds of people who are maybe coming up with a bunch of different ideas. So it's not, we don't want to just say like these are just different attitudes. There are different consequences. But so where we are right now, what do we do? And one thing that Nathan and I, my co-author and I did, was to try, in every one of our surveys, we tried some interventions to see if we could, at the very least, reduce people's approval of political violence. We had been measuring people's approval of political violence, and we found that basically in 2017, about 7% of partisans said it was okay to use political violence. Very quickly throughout the Trump administration and continuing to today, it got up to about 20% of Americans say that it might be okay to use political violence. And so we were just trying to see how we could reduce these attitudes. And one thing we tried was just a very simple, here's a sentence that either Donald Trump or Joe Biden said. And they really did say it, right? We took these sentences from actual things, speeches they had given. Trump said, "I condemn in the strongest possible terms all acts of violence. That has no place here." Biden said violence directed at anyone because of their political opinions is never acceptable, regardless of what those beliefs might be. And so it was an experiment. We had half of our sample read one of these, and the other half didn't read anything. And what we found was, we tried this twice, in 2019 and 2020. What we found was the people who read the anti-violence message from either leader became less approving of violence. And so in 2019, it was by about 3 percentage points, which is not a lot, but anything helps. And in 2020, it was by about 6 percentage points that people backed away from violence when they heard their leader say, that's not how we do things here. It's quite simple. It's difficult because certain leaders, I mean, I'm just going to, yeah, Trump himself is actually usually not saying these types of things, and so it makes it harder to put into practice, but it's actually quite simple to do. We also thought about, what do we know about how to change people's social norms, right? We used to have really strong social norms against overthrowing an election or using violence to advance political goals. And so we decided to think about what makes us remember social norms, what makes us remember how to be a good person and a good participant in a community or a society. And the first thing we thought was your favorite teacher from your childhood. Your family teaches you how to be a person in a family. Your teacher teaches you how to be a person in a community. And that teacher is the main source where you kind of learn what are the rules, not what are the laws, because when laws are broken, you have law enforcement. When norms are broken, you have to use social influence. And so we asked people to think about their favorite teacher. It kind of didn't work for the whole sample because the men didn't have as many favorite teachers. But for women, it did work. So what we found was when people had thought about their teacher, we nudged them to think about their teacher, they approved of political violence less, particularly among these pink lines, the women. The women who didn't think about their teacher had a higher level of approval of violence than the women who did think about their teacher. In the full sample, it didn't really work out because it washed out because of men in the sample. But so it does seem like, though, when you remind somebody of the thing that taught them how to be a good citizen, to be a good community member, they actually do step away from violence because they know that it's wrong. Okay, so finally, using this research, I sort of want to think about how do we go forward now, right? What are our solutions? What are our solutions to the deep divisiveness that we're feeling in American politics? And I think the first answer is to identify and prioritize the people who are trying to advance a pluralistic, multi-ethnic democracy, right? They exist in both parties, but their voices are often drowned out, particularly on the right. So how do we find these people who hold these attitudes that we measured, we found them, and how do we give them more voice? Or how do we encourage them to find their voice? The second is to strengthen those sub-identities. In the Republican Party in particular, we've been doing some convenings of Republican elected officials on a state level, sort of state and local leaders, who really just want to do elections and count the votes and get it right. Like, that's all they want. They want to do their job. And they're constantly receiving threats from partisans in their own party if they don't kind of do whatever crazy thing is happening that week. And so in strengthening these identities, but also being very careful about it, because these are the people who are the most frequent targets of violence and threats. They receive threats from within their own party if they effectively do their jobs, particularly if they're doing election administration. There were, in Arizona, in Georgia, in any state that is a close state, we have verified stories from these election officials who basically say, like, I was terrified, I had to move, they were threatening my children. So it's not safe and easy to do this, but it does seem like it's important. And also, we need to get better leadership. Our leaders need to be more responsible and to actually enforce these norms, right? To both our political elected leaders and our political media leaders, who sometimes are more powerful than the elected leaders. They have to remember that they are the role models for the rest of us. And if they behave in a way that advocates violence, then there's nothing that's going to make us stop being violent. We are watching them to get, and we often are influenced by them in ways that are subconscious that we don't even know, but we are very influenceable. And especially we need those messages, when there is a violent event, we need those messages, anti-violence messages, to come from people in the group that perpetrated the violence. Because if it's from the group that was the target of the violence, no one really listens. And then finally, and this is where you come in at the very end, the way that we enforce laws is law enforcement. The way that we enforce norms is social sanction. And it involves shame. And shame can be a really terrible emotion, and it can be used as a weapon. But it is an extremely powerful human emotion because it is the only way that we enforce norms. It's the only mechanism that we have. And so expressing dissatisfaction, expressing disapproval, if someone in your community is speaking in a way that advocates for violence, right, the people around that person are the only ones who can do anything about it. And especially in the absence of leadership that tries to take down the temperature, it's up to all of us. It's up to the people in our communities to try to remind each other what the norms are, what the democratic norms are, and how we behave as citizens of a functioning democracy that has a peaceful transfer of power. So I'm going to stop there. I went a little bit over, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Lily, for a very informative talk. I'm kind of still absorbing all of the data, which I knew was coming, and some of it's been in your books, and we know it's in your current research. We have a full audience here of political science, writing studies, rhetoric classes, I think a health studies class. So we have a number of people, communications, and so we're going to try to give at least 20 to 25 minutes for questions. But my colleague, Professor Wu, and Christina and I have a few questions that we want to ask you. And I'm actually going to break from what I was going to ask, because you ended with the importance of norms. And you also spoke about leadership, right? About comments about anti-violence. January 6th. How could that have been prevented? How do we prevent another one? Because I think it was just completely unexpected, absolute shock. And so, could you address that from the perspective of your research?
Yeah, and actually, so Nathan and I, we thought we had finished the manuscript of that book on January 3rd, 2021. We emailed it to the publisher, and 3 days later, they called us and they said, "You're not done with this book." We were actually worried that there would be a violent event. Nathan and I had been really paying attention because we're looking at these attitudes, and it looked like things were bad in the electorate as a whole. And you know, we didn't know which direction it would come out, but what Trump did there was really just provide permission and encouragement to people who were there to go. You know, he literally told them, "Go to the Capitol," and that type of influence. I mean, one of the more remarkable things I've seen on the reporting on January 6th is that there are so many people who were in there in the Capitol destroying things, saying, you know, someone on a video said to the other one, "Is this what we should be doing? Like, does he want us to do this?" And he said, "You know, he hasn't told us to stop." And then as soon as Trump did tell them to stop, he put out that reluctant tweet. The QAnon shaman said, "He told us to go, let's go," and he left. It seems pretty easy, actually, to stop it. And it's just as simple as it is for us to change people's attitudes about violence. They read one sentence in a survey, and they were like, "Okay," right? Like this is why I like to say the solution is simple but difficult. It's simple because all we need is better leadership, but it's difficult because our leaders are just not. It's not benefiting them to behave that way.
And then just a quick follow-up, and then I'll pass it to Christina. What about sanctions, the trials, the convictions, et cetera?
And we don't know yet. Right, this is going to be the first election that we have where people were really punished for engaging in that violence, and they don't want to. You know, people who have barely missed going to prison, or people who went to prison for a short time and have already come out, they don't want to go back. And so I think a lot of this. Also, there will be no other January 6th in D.C. this year in 2024. It just will not happen because Joe Biden is the president. They will lock down the city the way that they did for the inauguration. And it's already been demonstrated that it didn't work. My fear is really the state capitals, because by January 6th it was really too late for them to undo the outcome. But the states are where they are certifying it in the first place.
I'll come back to that. Okay. I'll turn it to Christina.
And this is almost a follow-up on that. Okay. In that, speaking of social identity, I'm the out-group here, given that there are two political scientists and I am the media scholar, so all of my questions are very much informed by my bias toward the media's role. And elsewhere, Dr. Mason, you spoke about the role of political leaders, and on the slides you even mentioned the norms that they set for the citizens and for their supporters. Personally, I've been deeply steeped in all of these research around conspiracy theories, right? The whole idea of, the superiority complex through which people feel like they're morally justified to take actions if the other side is just brainwashed or morally corrupted. So what do you think of the role that the established media, the legacy media, play in dialing that down or mediating?
No, this is a really good point. And I didn't present this data, but we asked people in 2019, about 20% of people said violence might be okay for achieving their political goals. But then we said, well, what if the other side starts it first? And then it went up to 40% saying violence is acceptable. We asked it again this past June, over this summer, and it went up from 20% to 60% saying that it would be acceptable. So there is a real sense that we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. If they start it, then we're going to get involved. And I think one thing that the media does, and a lot of political science research has shown, is it convinces us that people in the other party are much more different from us than they actually are. And so we stereotype people in the other party. We think that the party, Democrats think that Republicans, that like 30% of Republicans make over $250,000 a year, and actually it's like 2%. And Republicans think that Democrats are like 60% black and 50% LGBT, and none of those numbers are correct. And so to the extent that the media tries to encourage us to have these stereotypical thoughts, it actually makes us dislike each other more, and it makes us more open to violence, because we think that they are already so far gone. So, but you don't often see media saying, actually, the other side is so much more like us than we ever imagined, because nobody wants to watch that. No one's going to click on the article, they're not going to tune into the show, and it doesn't get them what they want, which is attention.
I'm debating whether I ask about media or federalism, but I'll keep with the federalism, because you spoke about institutions, right, and the certification of the vote, which happens in every state capital in December. It's not in Washington, D.C. And clearly, we know that this race, the presidential election, less than 6 weeks away now, could be either a very strong victory, close to 350 electoral college votes, could be just at 270 when you look at the map, or could be 269, in which case it goes to the House of Representatives, right? Can you tie in some of your research on social polarization and how to address it and threats of violence to the challenge of federalism, where we have education systems that are largely paid for through property taxes. You have national parties, but you have state and local parties. You have very different curricula. You were talking about teachers. We have different institutions, right? Variations to states that don't give their electoral college vote to who wins the popular vote, but 48 do. So how does federalism complicate social polarization, and how do we address that in our system?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that one thing that this Supreme Court has done is, by removing a lot of federal protections that we used to have, that we all had the same basic things, rules of how we are allowed to live as a country. What the court did was not remove those rights from everybody. They just gave it to the states to decide. Abortion is the obvious example of this, but it also is the case with voting rights and a number of other things, right? And by doing that, what they actually have allowed is that the red states and the blue states' policies are diverging pretty remarkably. And so we're seeing, in states like Texas, you can be arrested for driving a woman across the state border, regardless. In blue states, they are increasing abortion availability and trying to make it more accessible, and they're allowing, they're providing sanctuary for women from other states. So what we're seeing is that the rights given to, in this case, a woman, if you're in one state or the other state, your personal rights are completely different depending on which state you're in, even though you're in the same country. And that, I think, is only making it more clear how different the parties are. And it's making it also easier for the parties to kind of point at each other and vilify each other, because you're basically saying, like, look, you're living in a different country. You're essentially not in the same country as I am. You have a different constitution. I mean, they don't, but it feels that way to people whose rights have been taken away from them.
Right.
And so I think in terms of federalism, that's the part that I find it to be the most stark, is watching these state governments move and change the way that they govern. It's not just attitudes in the state, right? It's actual governing policies that create a two-tiered system of government, but just depends on who you are. What rights you have depend on who you are and what state you're in.
Right. Yeah. So and that seems unlikely to change in the near future, right? With the composition of the Supreme Court, we seem to be in a period of kind of a new federalism, if you will, right? Go back to Nixon. How do people? Are we going to see more geographic shifts with people moving based on where, or the kind of the sorting continue geographically? Do you think that there will be pressures? We're seeing this with reproductive rights on the ballot in several states this year, right? That could affect turnout in the presidential race. How do you see that changing?
I mean, so what we know about geographical sorting is that people don't usually move states, right? It's really expensive. It's really disruptive. You often have neighbors and family and a system, support system for your kids, and your kids are in school. It's really difficult to move. I did it once. I moved states once, and I never want to do it again. It was so hard. You have to make new doctor's appointments. It's like your whole life is completely upended, and it costs a lot of money. And so most people can't do that. But also, most of the geographical segregation that we see is happening at much more micro levels. So Democrats live in the same neighborhoods together, and Republicans live in the same neighborhoods together, in the same city, right? Within Dallas, you have a Democratic neighborhood and Republican neighborhood. And so people decide where to live, on the local level. They can decide where to live based on these types of things. What's the friendlier neighborhood for my politics? What do the yard signs say? So they're still segregated from their opponents, but they're still in a state that gets to make decisions for them. So I think, we kind of try to think of like the red state, blue state thing, but actually it's so much more complex than that. There are plenty of people that live in both blue states and red states that completely disagree with the state government and are very unhappy with it. And those people are being affected nonetheless. So it's hard to fix it with moving, because we're all kind of stuck where we are, and we find our little place where we feel comfortable, and it's hard to leave that.
Well, that counters the kind of classic libertarian view, right? That if you don't like it, you can leave. But in fact, the layers of movement are much harder, right? Yeah.
And the argument has been made that if the politicians or leaders could play along and lead by example, show us that they could live close and hang out outside of work, or there's some argument made about like inter-party marrying or befriending. I don't know if that is practical, but going back to some of the slides where you talked about these identity politics that are very divisive, right? People are self-sorting, right? They dehumanize their opponents. But there's also the argument that this quote-unquote insult politics is not accurate, when in reality most Americans agree on a lot of issues, like environmental policies, gun policies, even educational policies. So what do you see?
And abortion.
Yeah, where the middle ground is, and again, the media's role, our political elite's role.
Right. I mean, there are a number of issues, and gun control and abortion are two of the most prominent ones, where even a majority of Republicans don't like what their party is doing. Right. Most American, I think it's like 80 to 90% of Americans want sensible gun reform. They want women to be able to access abortions if they need it, and they certainly don't want women to be forced into childbirth or whatever. So the party, though, doesn't pay a price for their constituents disagreeing with them. And I think that's where the insult comics content comes in. Because what they tell their voters is, you might disagree with me on this thing, but if you give the other side the chance to fix it, they're going to go overboard, and they're going to do it wrong, and you're going to be mad, and you're going to regret it. And also, they're godless, evil people, right? Like, I mean, by insulting people in the other party, you make it very difficult to vote for them if you're saying, look at them, they're evil. So maybe they'd fix gun control in a way that I would like, but I can't vote for evil, right? And by creating this good versus evil dynamic, it makes it very, very difficult, even though we have so many common preferences, it makes it very difficult to compromise. Because if someone is really evil, you don't compromise with that. You can't compromise with evil. And so the framing of it creates a system in which the parties aren't even being held accountable for not doing what their constituents want, because they're just so convinced that they can't possibly vote for the other side.
It's very reductive.
So we both have a lot more questions. I think maybe we'll ask one more each, and then we'll open it up. So reading your two books is not easy, right? About social polarization and political identity. And then the second book that came out 2 years ago about political violence and the rise and the willingness to accept the possibility. So your third project is the kind of the most hopeful one, right, of how we address this, and you discussed some of that, and you're doing that research now. Can you tell us where you see sources of optimism, particularly with our symposium theme of higher education, how we can reduce polarization and as a society and as individually? I mean, you ended with that, but if you could elaborate a little more, what we can do to reduce the threat of violence.
Yeah, I mean, so the first is what I said before, which is model it. Be a good example for the people around you, and don't let them get away with saying things that are dangerous. It's literally just us. We're the only ones who are protecting us. The people at the top have stopped, so we're the last ones. In terms of the kind of optimistic take, I said this to your class a little bit, but I think that first of all, this next book, the third book, is really going to be questioning the concept of polarization as the problem at all. If you think of polarization as us hating each other, that's a problem. But what the data are showing, and I didn't show you this data from an article I did in 2021, where we looked at basically like the people who liked Trump in 2018 there's a data set that interviews the same 10,000 people in 2011, and then again in 2016, 17, 18, 19, and 20. It's incredible. It's free. It's online. It's called the Voter Study Group. It's funded by the Democracy Fund. It's a fantastic data set. But basically what we did was we went and saw people who liked Trump in 2018. What did they have in common in 2011, before he really became a political figure? And what we found was that in general, the thing they had in common the most was that they didn't like marginalized groups. They didn't like Black Americans, Latinos, Muslims, and LGBT people. And anybody who held negative attitudes about any of those groups was more likely to like Trump in the future. But the other thing that I found, which this is kind of I think the center of the book, is that they didn't have a party in 2011. Most of them were independents. So there's always been a movement in America, always, throughout our entire history, of a kind of like ethno-nationalist, authoritarian type of preferences. And it's always about a quarter to a third of America. But in our two-party system, our parties have actually kept them relatively unsatisfied for most of American history, except for a couple of big exceptions. And so that group of people who felt still, in 2011, they still felt really politically homeless, they loved Trump. And they entered the Republican Party in droves, and they now basically can control it. And I spoke to a Republican legislator who was an old school Republican, and she was reelected in 2018. And she said, I looked out at my election night party, and I looked out at the audience, and for the first time ever, I didn't recognize 50% of the people in that room. So this is it's a changing party. It's not just the old party. There is an influx of people that have really taken charge. And when we have a two-party system, if we had multiple parties, then we could have that would be a party that would be a 25% party, right? They would always get about 25% of the support and 25% of the representation. But we have a two-party system where 25% of the American population can take control of 100% of the power due to various different institutional things that we have set up. And so really what I find scary is that particular process, that is the process that's happening. But because political scientists and political journalists are bound by these very strong rules of political neutrality, even when we can empirically see this process happening in front of us, and that's what the book is going to lay out, we can't talk about it without sounding partisan ourselves. And so we're much more willing to ignore it in the name of neutrality than to talk about it and come across as biased. And it's a real problem that we're having in sort of the way that we think about American politics and the way that we talk to the public about American politics. It's very difficult for us to even describe it.
So the optimism is really about changing the norms.
It's about changing the way we think about it. It's all, but the other optimistic part is thinking about, if you imagine a hypothetical United States that went through a lot of progress, social progress, and large numbers of previously marginalized people gained power over a few decades very rapidly, then in that imaginary world, you would not, I can't imagine a world that would not experience a backlash against that progress, especially rapid progress. And let's remember that same-sex marriage was only legalized less than 10 years ago. So the amount of progress that we've made so quickly it will inevitably create a backlash. Mm-hmm. And my optimistic moments are that we're just living through it. We have to live through it. Somebody has to live through it, right? Mm-hmm. It sucks to live through history, but maybe that's what we're doing. And depending on how we all, behave and participate in the society, then maybe we get through it.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a back seat if people want to start to walk over to the microphone. But the last question has to do with the information divide. Indeed, some scholars have argued that and found that the most involved from both parties actually tend to agree more than the more involved and the less involved, the less informed within the same party. Otherwise, information almost leads to agreements. I don't know what your stance is on the so-called information divide.
So there's people like me that study the differences between Democrats and Republicans, and then there's a book called The Other Divide by Yana Kripnikov and John Ryan, where they basically find what they look at is the difference between the people who pay attention to politics and the people who don't pay attention to politics, and that's really is it's a very deep divide in America, and there's a lot of people on the not paying attention side, and it's totally understandable, right? It's not stupidity. It's you're busy, you have a life, and we delegate power with our representatives. Their job is to represent us. We don't want to read every page of the legislation. We're not supposed to do that, and so the vast majority of Americans, or the majority of Americans, just isn't thinking about politics most of the time. And that's partly where you find the swing voters, where they just most of the time, for 4 years, they don't pay any attention to politics, and then it gets to the election, and they think, well, I got to figure out who I'm voting for, and then all of a sudden try to get as much information as they possibly can in as little time as possible, because they don't have time, they're busy, and that creates strange decision making, I think. But also, and this goes back to a book that was written at the very beginning of the study of American political behavior. It was written in 1960. What they said was, those people still existed in 1960, obviously, and what they said was, these people are the only ones who can change politics, because everybody else votes for their party every single time, and there's very little you can do to change a partisan's vote, but you can change their votes, you can affect their votes, and they can be persuaded. And so it's sort of ironic that the people who can save our democracy are the ones who pay the least attention to it.
And after 2 years of campaigning, right? Yeah. All of the work, the build-up.
Well, should we open up the discussion? We have microphones on either side. We are recording this for future classes, so if you could go to the microphone and ask your question.
Hello. I just have a quick question. You were talking about how politicians or the media will talk about things, and it directly, relates to how people behave. Many times on some of the media outlets, and President Biden and Vice President Harris talk about Trump being a threat to democracy. Do you think that kind of rhetoric is directly connected with the 2 assassination attempts?
Yeah, so I don't, largely because the people who tried to assassinate him were not really, they're not Democrats, right? It wasn't like the direct line from the leader of the party to a strong partisan who listens to the leader. It just, the first one was a troubled young man, and the second was also a troubled older man. They're obviously going to be troubled. I think that there's one way to think about this, which is when we talk about the threat that somebody poses to our democracy, that can feel like maybe we should eliminate that person. Maybe we should use violence to get rid of them. But it can also just mean the democratic process. It can mean the way that we do our things. And the other thing, and I wrote, I have an article, Nathan and I have an article in Foreign Affairs, I think a month ago, where we kind of make this argument, which is there are a number of reasons why our politics are so like on fire right now, and it's not because of the rhetoric of one of the two right? It's not just because Democrats say that Trump is a threat. And Trump has used, ever since 2015, he's been using increasingly pro-violence language. He tells the crowd to beat somebody up. He talks about, find people on both sides. Like he's, the type of rhetoric that we hear from him in particular, right? This is not, I'm not saying Republicans in general, but he talks differently than Republicans used to talk. And that style, it creates a more combative political environment. So it's, and if Harris thinks he presents a threat to democracy, she can maybe say it in a more, sort of calm and less aggravating way. But she shouldn't stop saying it, right? If that's what she actually professionally believes and what empirical evidence is showing. Thank you for your question.
Hi, really enjoyed the presentation, thank you. I'm just wondering, have you looked at a relationship between the rise of hate speech, the rise of social media, and the rise of moral disengagement?
So, I haven't looked directly at that. You mean social media, like allowing hate speech to proliferate?
Yeah, particularly looking at regulation, moderation of social media sites, the rise of truth media, truth social media.
So one thing that, so the algorithms, first of all, of social media tend to prioritize angry responses. Facebook prioritizes posts where somebody responds with an angry face. For the 2 weeks after the 2020 election, they switched to prioritizing posts that had a happy face. And it did change. It changed the environment on Facebook. And after 2 weeks, they changed it back because people were not engaging in the way that they had been. Conflict is what we pay attention to. And so any organization, any institution that's vying for human attention, the basic reality of human psychology is give them a fight. I mean, evolutionarily, if you're walking past, a couple people in an argument, you might stop and try to figure out what's going on because maybe it'll get dangerous, and you need to know that. If you're walking by people just, sitting and reading poetry to each other, you have time to come back to that later. It's not an emergency for you. And so your brain won't necessarily be attracted to it as quickly. So understanding human psychology, social media gives us what we are going to pay attention to. And it's not good for us, but it's good for them, and it's good for their bottom line.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's really tough to have the inside seat.
Oh, this is tall. Hi, I was listening to the New York Times podcast, The Daily, in the last couple of months, and they had said that both Democrats and Republicans' views show that they seem to think that the other party hates them a lot more than they actually do. What are some solutions to this that you think there are, and do you think that this view has ramifications on individuals being willing to vote across party lines?
Yeah. And this also comes back to the media, right? Because the type of language that we hear from media personalities is they hate you, they're coming for you, they're going to take your family, they're going to take your whatever, right? And the us-them language is very, very common in partisan media. Partially because it reinforces you should be watching my thing and not those, you pay attention to me because I'm telling you what's dangerous and I'm on your side. I think the political scientists who've studied this, they've done little, do little website exercises where it's like, what percentage of people in the other party do you think of you as lazy or dishonest or, some bad stereotype? And people will, click a number, and then the survey will say, no, you're wrong. It's actually only, 2% of them. And that has worked in the survey context. It does work to make people kind of take a step back, and they're less likely to rate people in the other party cold on the feeling thermometer. They're less likely to say, I don't want them to live next door to me. So it does work. The problem with all of these interventions, including our intervention, is that then the real world happens. They stop taking the survey, and then they keep being exposed to all this language everywhere around them. So the one little thing they did in the survey is very, very quickly overwhelmed by everything else. And so that's the challenge, right? The challenge is this environment in which everyone is speaking in a way that makes everything feel very, very consequential, which it is. But leaders are really not, it's not political, it's not necessarily elected leaders. I think it's media leaders. We've gotten to a place where media personalities have more power, especially with Fox News. They have more power than the candidates themselves do. Because if the candidate does something that the Fox News people don't like, they will talk about it on their show. And the people who watch their show will get mad about it, and then they will punish the candidate. But if the candidate does something that they don't like and Fox doesn't care, then the constituents never hear about it, and they don't get mad, and they don't hold them accountable, right? So there's like this mediator between the voters and the candidate that is extremely influential, and at the same time tends to use us versus them language constantly in order to get attention. So I think it is a question about how we talk, and it's a question about how we respond when our friends talk and our family talks, but it's also the world is giving all of us a really distorted view of where we're living and who our fellow citizens are. And I don't know how to stop that from happening. Sorry.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you think then people such as like Pete Buttigieg, who frequent Fox News to try to talk to people that he wouldn't normally align with and reach different viewers, do you think that has a positive impact on eliminating some of that?
Yeah, I think it can. We all engage in motivated reasoning. So we want to accept information that makes us look good and the other guys look bad, and we are going to reject information that does the opposite. So people who are watching may disagree with him a lot, and they might be counter-arguing the things that he's saying while he's saying it, right? And I'm sure that they are. And one thing that we've actually found with motivated reasoning is that the people who are the most vulnerable to engaging in motivated reasoning are the people who know the most about politics. Because they have all the arguments to say, okay, he said this, Buttigieg said this, I know that's not true because I read this thing, or I saw this video, or whatever, right? The people who don't know very much about politics are actually the ones who will be receptive to that type of thing. So, he's speaking to a lot of different audiences when he does something like that. But I agree with you that it's a good, right? It's a good thing to allow your voice to be heard in a non-combative way in spaces where you don't normally get heard.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello. My question is, you spoke on the fact that this sort of like playbook of social norms that we've set in a society has seen like a decline in like the last few decades. What do you think has contributed to that? Because my thought when you were also speaking on, how teachers had like a direct influence on that, has it been like our educational system? Has that played a role in it?
Yeah. I still think that teachers do a good job of teaching us how to be people, right? My kids learned a lot more from their teacher about, the basic rules of society than I could ever teach them because we didn't have to interact in that way in the house. So I think that, and especially in the earlier grades, right, in elementary school in particular, like those are the teachers that really have a big impact. And I think they try their best, I really do. It really, I think, is much more about our role models, right? It's the adults who are out in the world participating in politics on our behalf. And we watch them and we learn from them what kind of thing, what kind of behavior we're supposed to use and what kind of language we can use. The sort of, the amount of racist and misogynistic and homophobic language that currently exists is more than it was 10 years ago, that we kind of just expect to hear. And so the norms have truly eroded around things like using hateful language that goes against marginalized groups. And so to the extent that, and part of the reason for that is that, I hate going back to Trump all the time, but he really has been a very unique political character in American politics. And one thing that he did was he broke all the rules, which people have done throughout history. But then when he got caught, he didn't say he was sorry. He didn't express any shame. He didn't express any remorse. He just kept going. And no one knew what to do with that, because the only thing that you can do to enforce the norm is to say, stop doing it. And if the person doesn't stop, then you're done, right? There's very little that you can actually do. And I think that he's maybe uniquely psychologically oriented in a way that doesn't allow him to feel shame, right? I mean, that's possible because most politicians, when they do something wrong, you can see it in their face that they feel bad, right? Not they feel bad, but they're embarrassed, and they know that they shouldn't have done it, and often they do apologize. But their reaction to that is often disqualifying for them, because people just say, like, well, look what you did. You did something wrong. And even in when was it, the macaca moment?
Oh, right. George Allen, Virginia.
Allen, yeah, Virginia, running for the Senate.
It's 2006, I think.
2006?
Yeah, I think so.
Right. So he used what sounded like a racial slur. No one even really knew what that meant, to somebody who was, filming him at his rally. And everyone was kind of, immediately said, that's not okay. You can't talk that way. This is not in his race. He lost his race. He disappeared from politics. And that is how things were in 2006.
Yeah, roughly, yeah.
And 10 years later, we have Trump, doing the Access Hollywood tape, and everyone tries to do that same thing, and it doesn't work. So that's where I think the norms get broken, is when someone breaks the norm flagrantly and refuses to feel ashamed of breaking that norm. And that takes a very unique person.
Thank you. Let me ask a question while someone's coming down. It seems as though your response has been that for addressing the problem here is largely behavioral, right? It's individual. You seem to be focusing on individuals in groups more than institutional change. Is that, but you've kind of alluded to some of the challenges of our institution. Is that because institutional change is too difficult, not realistic now? Just
It's just because I study political behavior.
Okay, so
these are the tools I have.
Okay,
They're the ones that I can use. I mean, I do. Ideally, there certainly are institutional changes that should happen that would help, but they are extremely unfeasible in our political system, and I don't know how to do it. So I'm just telling you what I know how to do.
Well, it's a tall order with the behavioral change. Please, I think someone was coming down.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So you just said when somebody breaks the rule, that today, when somebody breaks the rules, that they don't apologize and that person then is outside. But it feels to me like so you can label somebody a sociopath, right? Mm-hmm. But that doesn't explain all the allies that allow the rule breaking. And that seems to me what the big change is. Anybody could be nuts at any given moment in America. But what we have is allies allowing that behavior to go on, correct?
Yeah. I mean, so I think that there's two things. One is going back to the leadership role, right? It's not just anybody, it's a leader. And they do have outsized influence on us. The other thing, though, is that there is a real joy in transgression that people clearly feel, right? As you all probably experienced, Trump rallies are not just full of angry, vicious people, right? They're having a great time. They're happy. They're joyful. And it's fun. Right, exactly.
Next to us, not here.
Yeah. It's fun to break the rules. And it's like, the principal's gone and the kids take over the school. That's fun. And so I do think that what Trump did was not only allow people to break the norms, because he showed them that it's okay to do it, but then they started doing it, and they were pissing people off, and they were having a good time. So there is, and this is also one of the things that when we look at like extremist groups, the people who are attracted to extremist groups are people who already feel somewhat uncertain about their lives and their place in the world. And the extremist group has a completely different set of rules and a very strict set of rules around it. There are certain things that you have to do that are counter to normal society, and there are certain things that you are not allowed to do at all within the extremist group. And so usually uncertain people are attracted to groups like that because it feels very reassuring to be in a group where you know the rules. They're different than the old rules, but they're clear, and you know where you can go and where you can't go. And that is sort of like what we see with some of these Trump supporters in particular, is that they delight in breaking the rules, but the rules for them they're not breaking them. they're adhering to a very different set of rules in a sub-society that they have basically been brought into.
Yeah, I think I have to clarify. I think I must have been unclear. I don't mean people at the rallies. I'm talking about the enablers in Congress.
Oh, them.
Yeah. So I wasn't clear.
Yeah. No, I mean, they're not as good at it. They're not, right? Like what's his name? Ron DeSantis tried to be Trump, and he couldn't get away with it. His face betrays him. He clearly feels really uncomfortable and awkward trying to engage in this type of behavior that he knows people are really going to not like. And most of these people, most of the leaders in Congress, they get punished from their constituents if they don't, if they don't follow along. They're also not very good at mimicking it, right? There's not very many people who can get away with doing what Trump does. Instead, they stand behind him because he has attracted this very powerful base of voters, and they will lose their jobs. Or, this is the other thing, they will get death threats if they stand up to him. And they have. And they also get kicked out of the party. And so the people who've stood up to him have sacrificed their careers and have sacrificed their family's safety in order to do that. And most people don't want to do that. It takes a huge amount of courage and really kind of, I don't even know, I don't know how they do it. I find it remarkable because it's not a fun life after they do that. They are deeply punished. And so, and this is one of the things where we're doing these convenings with some of these local Republicans who want to say something. They don't like Trump. They don't want to enable him, but they're terrified. And they have received death threats, and they have, their kids have been threatened. It's not, it's truly authoritarian, right? I mean, this is what an authoritarian regime does. But they are the only people who can really change anything, and they feel completely alone and isolated. And so it's really hard for them not to.
Okay, thanks.
We're about wrapping up. We can take one more question. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, this might kind of sound a little weird here, but I have been hearing like Trump's gonna get his number and phrases like that, and it kind of feels like I am kind of betraying my own party because I remember sitting on the couch with my girlfriend and we just saw assassination happen, and we're like, oh gosh, what's going to happen now? And then we're in a state where basically we already know who's going to win this state. But I just registered to vote, and I'm like, does it even matter now?
It does matter. You should vote. Even in New York, you should vote. You become part of the popular vote, which is it's not a number that determines the outcome, but it certainly is a signal. And honestly, participating in politics and voting should be something that becomes a habit for everybody, right? If we're responsible citizens, we're participating in our politics, and we're engaging with democracy, not just when you vote, but a lot more of the time than that. Do you have it? Okay.
Oh, this is making my brain hurt.
No, we'll end on the optimistic note. How about that? Okay, about the call for voting.
You should vote. Everybody should vote.
And appreciate a very thoughtful question there. Let me just say. Let me say that there were several student questions. I've been told that the students can go up to the desk outside and choose one of Dr. Mason's books. We are happy to give you one, and I think she'll be available to sign for a few minutes. Yeah. This concludes our symposium on higher education in an election year. Thanks to the president, the provost, the colleges, and to our speaker and my co-author.
Thank you.
Thank you,
My
everyone.
pleasure.